Well, welcome to Hearing God's Voice podcast. And I have an exciting working podcast today because I've enjoyed watching for over a year this Christian counselor truly give her heart and soul to so many. And you're going to learn a lot about her, but I'm not going to waste time in regards to trying to go through her resume. I want you to meet a wonderful new podcast guest, which is Leslie Vernick. Leslie, welcome to Hearing God's Voice podcast. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Jeffrey, for inviting me.
That's great. Leslie, give the audience kind of a snapshot because you haven't been doing this for just a couple of days, and this is not your first rodeo around the podcast information. But I want you to kind of give the audience just a broad spectrum, a stroke of where'd you come from, how'd you get here, and what are you doing with all that you've learned in that journey.
Wow. So I'll try to say it in a sentence or two. Came from a broken home. My parents divorced when I was 8 years old. I was the oldest, and this was when broken homes and single moms were very rare. So I felt a lot of shame around that. I was the only kid whose parents were divorced, and moved to the city of Chicago. Lived in a one-bedroom apartment. My mom was an alcoholic. She was also had some mental health problems. I would probably say they thought at the time it was schizophrenia. I think it really was bipolar. But the scary part of it was she never had the depression part. She only had the manic part. So it became very psychotic at times and crazy. And so she was abusive to me, and mostly me, I think probably because I represented a lot of the values that my father had, or even the personality. And of course, divorcing him, she didn't like him or me at that time. And so she took a lot of her frustrations out on me. She was abusive, physically, emotionally, verbally, and said a lot of hurtful things. And by the time I got to high school, I didn't go to school very much because I figured out that if I could clean the house while she was at work, then she would be happy when she came home, and then I wouldn't get in trouble and I could just walk the streets or do whatever I wanted. But my dad had become a Christian, and he had been petitioning the courts for years to get custody of us because he saw what was going on. But back then, dads rarely got custody of their kids. And so he had fought for years, but this time he did when I was in high school. And so finally we had to move into his house, which at that time I wasn't happy about because my dad represented rules and church and school and all the things that I didn't want to do. I was running the streets of Chicago. I was having a good time. And I had figured out how to stay out of my mom's way most of the time. And I was getting as big as her. So it was a little harder for her to hurt me like she used to. So, so I had to move, and God got a hold of my heart when I was in high school. My mom sort of left the scene. She didn't have a lot to do with us after that. She moved to Florida. We didn't have a lot of contact with her. And then she came back, and she came into my life again. And, even though she had been out of my life for a little bit, her voice was still in my head, and her voice of who I was still hurt who I felt I could be. And so this was a wrestling match because, I accepted the Lord, and yet I still felt broken. And I think that's led me to my field. I work with relationships. I work with broken relationships. I work with abusive relationships, and they're not always fixable. My mom's and my relationship wasn't fixable until the very end of her life because she wasn't willing to be a safe person. And you can't have a good relationship when you're scared of someone, whether they're your mother or your husband. And so it's really hard to do that. But so that's led me to do a lot of work around abuse. What does the Bible say about abuse? How do we do relationships in a good way? How do we not shame someone when they can't fix a relationship? Paul says, as much as it depends on you, be at peace with everybody. But it doesn't just depend on you. It requires two people to make a good relationship.
I'm glad you put that quote in there too, Leslie, because one of the comments of one of the people that had made comments about you on your About page was that you were true to Scripture. And to me, that's rich to my heart. But you also go deeper than just the verse. And I really respect that so much, because very few people, especially Christians, that just grab a verse on Sunday or they grab a verse from a devotional, they don't take it into the life application. And then putting a couple others that really apply, as you have done in some of your teachings, I'm sure you'll do now, where Jesus kind of clears that up for even the disciples when he's going through some relational difficulties at that point. But you were in a place very young at 16 years old, and you were sitting in Chicago on a stump, it said, and a stoop or wherever it was that you were sitting at someone's house, and God spoke to you. Would you unwrap that for us and show us how that voice of God really began to form your life?
Yeah, it was a time that my mom was back, and she was not well. She wasn't, whether, at 16, I didn't know what was wrong with her, but she was behaving poorly. And she said some very ugly things about me. I was worthless. I almost even can't even remember exactly what she said, because God has done some healing in that.
Mm.
But she said really ugly things and just threatened to kill me. And so I can't remember exactly what it was, if she slammed the door and I'm sitting on the stoop on the outside or whatever. And I'm just sitting on that stoop and I'm just broken. I'm just broken. I mean, how does a person deal with their own mother's hatred of them and abuse of them? And so I'm sitting on the stoop and I'm crying and I'm hearing the Lord say to me, Leslie, that's not who you are. You are my beloved child. I've put gifts and talents and abilities inside of you. You got to decide, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the words of this broken woman? Or are you going to believe me? And that was a real moment for me where I woke up, so to speak, in terms of truth. When Jesus says the truth will set you free, it's not just words on a page. It's truth. And who am I? Our very identity doesn't get to be defined by a mere mortal. God has made us and he defines us. And just because my mom devalued me and discarded me and threw me away doesn't mean I was worthless. And recently we had this really fun illustration with the women I work with. She got really mad at her husband, and she was very wealthy, and she had this big rock diamond ring, and she took it off her finger and she threw it down the toilet. She flushed it. And just because she threw that ring away didn't make the ring worthless. The ring was a valuable ring. Just in a moment of craziness, she devalued it. And it just reminded me of that story of my mother, that, because of her own issues, she devalued her children. And even at the end of her life, she owned that, but she didn't know how to value us. But I didn't have to let that define me, her behaviors. And so that was really healing as God spoke to me in that moment.
One of the scriptures that I love is out of Romans 12:2, which almost relates to what you were saying. He says, no longer let the world conform you. And it doesn't matter if it's a mom, dad, and sometimes those are the worst impressions, could be the worst impressions that are in Boston, us just because of the relationship, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I just tie that back to another scripture in 1 Corinthians 2:16, that we have the mind of Christ, but you did something. It's not good enough to just know that scripture. It's you did something. You made a choice to acknowledge and accept and believe what he said. You're preciously and wonderfully made, Psalms 139 says. That was pretty mature for a 16-year-old, or however old you were. Was there some training? Was there coaching? Was there anything that you had to really identify and be able to hear God's voice and then to be obedient to it and to accept it?
Not really. I mean, when I became a Christian, I went to a normal church. It wasn't anything that trained us to do anything supernatural. It wasn't a charismatic church, any of that leaning. So I've had a couple of those moments in my life where I just knew it was the voice of God. It was so different than what I would have thought. You see, sometimes we say, oh, that just must be me, my own self-talk. This was so different than my own self-talk, because my own self-talk was negative and, just like my mother's talk to me. So this was so different that it really it was, it wasn't a bright light or anything, but it was just such a strong voice in my spirit that it wasn't mine. And that was a comfort to me, that I could rely on God and who he was and who he said I was, and that he was there with me, even in that dark moment, and that I could trust him. And that has been, a defining thing for my life, is that when God says it, I believe it. And sometimes it doesn't feel it, but the feelings are damaged and those have to heal, and you have to work through that. But to really start living that truth is part of what we are supposed to do in repentance, is turn around and start walking the truth.
We do a workshop, Leslie, called You're Beautiful. And it's majorly women that are taking that course. And we have a little exercise that we do. We talk a lot about the false images, the false beliefs, which are those thoughts that we need to take captive. But it's hard. You're so crippled at times, especially if you've believed a lot of those, lived them, and become one with them. And we take a mirror and we make them break the mirror.
Mm.
as they're looking to it. And on the other side of the mirror is a new mirror. And that represents now, as we begin to give them confirmations, declarations, affirmations from the scriptures of who they really are in Christ Jesus, in the image and likeness of him. That episode that you had, and I got to tell you, even before the show, I showed you, that was impressive to me when I heard different interviews and you used that illustration of going through that process, because it began the staircase, it seems, of your whole career way back at 16 years old, before being a Christian psychologist or anything else. It created your ability to take a life experience and let God really transform it. And now you've taken it into the world of helping people. And I don't think there's any better calling to what Christ says, go make disciples out of all nations. You're doing that. I mean, with a beautiful, beautiful work of it. And then you go forward in your life and you started writing books and things. You told me that you had heard God's voice kind of direct you in that direction. Give us that story, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So after, that moment and, continued going to school and went back to school and did school and went to college. I never thought I would go to college because, like I said, I barely went to 8th grade, but I did finish high school and I went to college. And I felt like I didn't like math or science. So I knew I wanted to help people. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I thought maybe I'd be a teacher or, social worker. So I decided to go for college, and then I mastered in social work. And I decided I'm not going to get my PhD because I can't write. That was a limiting belief I had, but it was a belief I believed. And so I didn't know it was an unbelief. I just believed it, just like we all believe a lot of lies. I can't write well enough to get a PhD. So I finished my graduate school, did, counseling work and, just did my normal stuff. Never wrote again. I mean, after I was done with school, I was glad I never wrote again. Well, here I am, 40 years old, 2 kids at home. I'm just a counselor, I have a counseling practice, I'm not a name anywhere. I'm just doing my job. And I turned 40 and God said to me, and this was another one like that's so different out of my wheelhouse because it wasn't anything I aspired to. He said, Leslie, I want you to write a book. And I'm like, who, me? And then this is a really funny story. So I went to church that Sunday. I told my husband, I said, I think God's calling me to write a book. Can you imagine? I don't know how to write anymore. And I'm sitting in church, and I didn't attend a charismatic church. I attended an evangelical free church. My pastor is talking about in 1 Corinthians, the gifts, and he said, I don't know why I'm saying this, but the Lord's leading me to say someone here is supposed to be writing a book. That's the weirdest thing for both of us, because it was like I attended a church about 500 people, and he said, somebody here is supposed to be writing a book. And that was so unusual for him to say that. And then someone from church came up to me and she said, is that you? And I thought, this is very weird. And I think God needed to confirm it to me 3 times to make me really take heart. And this is what I did. I believed him, but I didn't know what to do. And so the first step, so I'm 40, first step is I said, I don't even remember punctuation, grammar. I never got a big A on my paper. You should be a writer someday from any of my teachers. Mm-hmm. And it was a total walk of faith that I didn't have any self-confidence. I didn't have any confidence in my abilities. All I had was confidence that God said he wanted me to do it, so he would equip me. But then I had to equip myself too. I had to walk it out. I had to fan into flames the gifts that God has given me. So I said, Lord, you have to give me the gift of tongues and writing. And so I went to community college, and I just took a writing 101 class and started the journey. My book didn't come out for 8 years. So it was 8 years of believing God and letting him prepare me both in my spirit and my skills to be able to write my first book.
What a beautiful story. The confirmation of God's voice is so neat, because he'll get us our message, even if we get a hardened heart at times and say, no, I can't do that, or I'm unable. And it's always interesting that he always asks us to do something that is impossible, or it isn't the natural, simply because he gets all the glory and gets all the recognition.
Absolutely.
First to us. So 8 years. And again, you think about Joseph, you think about Abraham, everybody who's gone through those long windows of time waiting for David, all the years to become king, but you held in there. But you also said something else that I want the audience to hear, because a lot of people may hear, God's voice, or they get an, impression that they're supposed to do something, but then they sit on their hands and they don't make the steps. And I remember Mother Teresa had a quote that said, I do everything like it depends on me, but I believe with all my heart and all my mind that it depends on God. that's a partnership. And you've talked about partnerships in regards to helping get through relationships. Tell us about either a marriage or any kind of relationship that people have that are difficulty, which is your specialty, listening to that voice and partnering with that voice to be able to get through the tough times that you must deal with on a daily basis with Christian counseling.
I do. I work with a lot of women, mostly women who are married in destructive marriages. So it's not a difficult marriage. It's not just a disappointing marriage. It's a destructive, abusive marriage. And so for so long, and so I know what that feels like, not in a marriage. I have a good husband, but for living as a child in that kind of environment, my mother was very destructive. She was abusive to my dad, to me. And it's traumatic, and it takes its toll on kids, and it takes its toll on our spirit. I'm reading through Proverbs. We tend to take the day of the month and read through Proverbs and just reminded again of how, Proverbs says it's better to live on the corner of a rooftop than with an angry, contentious person. It takes its toll on your physical body. So often and so for so long, the church has valued the sanctity of marriage and neglected the safety and the sanity of the people in it. And so I've kind of reversed that and said, God loves marriage. He's created it, but he hasn't created it to be a prison for one person to abuse another, for the oppressor to oppress the oppressed. God hates that. And so to really help a woman believe what God says, that you're not just an object to use to stay married to a man who abuses, and to really see her value and her worth and that her dignity, and that being a strong woman isn't being a bad woman. God says, for example, in Proverbs, she was clothed with strength and dignity, and she smiled at the future unafraid. And so really helping a woman begin to see themselves differently than perhaps they've been told they are, either through their church teaching or through their husband's voice. And oftentimes these women have also come up in families that repeat the same generational sins over and over again. And really helping them listen that God cares about their safety, that safety is an important value for God. It's not just stay married at all costs, but if you're not safe, just like when God values us to listen to the authorities in the government. And yet when baby Jesus was going to be killed by Herod, God didn't say, well, just trust me. He said, get out of there, go flee. And, when Moses was going to be, all the babies were going to be killed, the midwives didn't honor the Pharaoh's orders. They resisted it. And I think we have to begin to help Christian women or men who are being abused understand that suffering and sacrifice, although are great virtues for Christians, should not be used to enable sin to flourish.
And that brings us back to the scriptures again and hearing God's voice. Being responsible for ourselves to be safe is really a work in process that takes us to really study the scriptures. Because let's say that somebody said, honor your husband. And I've heard this. I mean, it gives me quivers when I hear it, at any cost, just honor him or respect him. And he's a jerk. He's really abusive and all that type of thing, which is a lot of what you work with. But to be able to take then and continue to seek God for that answer for their own individual case, not to just jump out of the marriage or whatever it is, and not just to take the abuse, it takes that personal responsibility to do what you did back on the stoop in Chicago, to hear his voice and believe it, and continue to listen to it and follow what you're learning. And it's a progressive development for all of us, is that you continue to go deeper and deeper if you keep listening, coming more intimate with him, just like a great marriage. I love Songs of Solomon. My wife and I, when we first got married, we would read that to each other like the play, the lover and the beloved. And it is like provocative. I mean, it's in the Bible, but it's provocative. So in turn, you need both parties working with the process of knowing their personal relationship with Christ. Because, I have a beautiful wife, 42 years of marriage, and she's precious and wonderful, and I love her. But we are Italian, so we have very heated, spiritual discussions at times. But in turn, we'll go into our personal prayer time the next morning, and the first thing that comes up in my journal is, Lord, how am I doing with Zena? And he begins to download, minister to me, take me to scriptures so that I see what I'm doing possibly incorrect, what I could do better, or what I have to listen to it. And this is one thing that I know I've heard you say, being there is the most important part when you're in a relationship, correct? You've said that before in many of your interviews. And it's interesting because my wife's only desire is when I'm with her having coffee, I'm here with her, no place else. And that's sometimes more difficult than it is, especially for somebody who's, active and busy and that type of thing.
Right.
But that's my challenge. That's my challenge and my continual refinement at that point. But
But the
if
fact
I'd have
that
heard,
but the fact that you value your wife's voice and she has input into you and says, this is what I need, or this is what's important to me, and you honor that, is part of the beauty of a good relationship. The problem in the people I work with is that they don't have that respect. And it's hard, even in Proverbs, it says, don't honor a fool. So when your husband's acting foolish and destructive, it's telling you not to do that, and not just for your safety. But when we do that, we actually allow the fool to stay deluded that their behavior isn't that bad, and that's not good for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, boy, what a perfect word that is. When you go back to what you've learned in your counseling in that very area, because again, and I've married a lot of people at the altar, and I have meetings with them before we give them the marriage vows, and I ask them why they love each other at that moment, and we write it down. I said, because I want, at least on your anniversary, if nothing else, if not more, open that up and remind yourself, Philippians 4:8, think upon the good things that are pleasing and perfect, because life goes on, and life's got some curves in it. But so often then you get to these areas that's forgotten, and they walk away from that, and they forget how much they love that person and why they love that person, and they begin to almost hate that which they loved at one time. Do you find that to be a problem in relationships of marriage or any other type of relationship?
Yeah, and I, as long as both people are relatively healthy and willing to talk that through, I could say that might be somewhat of a difficult marriage sometimes, or a disappointing, like, oh, I love that they were so friendly and so helpful to everybody, and now I hate it because he's never home, kind of thing. And how do we, talk about that and work it through? So when we're talking about destructive marriages, we're talking much more about oppressive control, devaluing someone's personhood, so that those kind of even conversations don't happen. You're not allowed to give your husband feedback on, hey, I love that you're so kind to everyone, except for I'm feeling a little neglected, and he would hear that. So in our situations, you're not even allowed to say something like that without getting a verbal tongue lashing or being told you're an unruly, unsubmissive wife. And so then you start to lose your perspective, and it must be me, and what am I doing wrong? And it's really kind of crazy making in the situations that I'm more working with. But I think that, every marriage, you have a wake-up call, and you have to learn to love the person. I remember in a marriage counseling setting, I was working with this couple, and she said, well, you're not the man I married. And he goes, I absolutely am the man you married, but the man you dated, he was a fake. We always put our best foot forward in our dating. And he said, I just did these things because you wanted me to, but I didn't really like them.
That was on the disclaimer on the wedding. Let me take the audience into your practice of life. You had inner healing. You had true inner healing to go through what you went through. Can you give the audience at least some points of how do they deal with inner healing? How do they go after inner healing that can help them on a day-to-day basis? They need counseling. They should definitely give you a call. We're gonna have all the contact information for you. And I just pray that everybody that needs it will truly reach out to you. But in turn, is there anything you can share for inner healing when someone's been hurt, or they're in the midst of this kind of situation and it's not resolving quickly for whatever reason?
Well, I think there's two parts of inner healing. And one is that you have to identify the lies that you're believing, because, your lies create your reality. I have a very funny video on my Instagram recently. I went hiking, and, so I live in Arizona, there's beautiful hiking. And my friend said, oh, check the bathroom, because we go hiking, you don't want to have to go when you're out there. So I said, oh, it's locked. It had a big old padlock on there. And I looked at it and said, it's locked. And so she goes up and she goes, you know what? I don't know that it's really locked. And she opens the door and it wasn't locked. But my belief, it's locked, created my reality that I never even tried to see if the door was open. Right. And it really was a very powerful story about our beliefs. Our beliefs determine what action steps we take. I didn't take the action step to even try, because my belief was the door was locked. And so part of understanding that when God says he wants us to be transformed by the renewing of our mind is we have to start understanding our false beliefs, the things that we think are so true, like I can't write, or the door is locked, or, nobody loves me, or I'm no good at that, or, I'm a weak person. That may not be true at all. But because you believe that, that's your reality. And that's the options you have because the door's locked. And so this is a really important part of inner healing is God is always giving us information of truth, but we have filters and the door was open. I just didn't even try it. And so it's really important that we begin to allow other people to, like that woman who said, oh, the door's open, and she opened it and she showed me. God shows us, his word shows us, your pastor shows you, but sometimes you just don't believe it until you take a step of faith. And sometimes it's those action steps. So when God was with me in that stoop, or even in that moment of, I want you to write a book, I could have just heard that and said, okay, God, well, tell me what book you want me to write. But he didn't tell me what book he wanted me to write for 8 years. But what he said is, prepare yourself to be ready. Like Joshua had to go around Jericho. He had to do what the work was of walking in faith. And sometimes we don't know what the outcome of that will be. I never knew if it was actually going to be a book for me or a journal. I didn't know what it was going to be. I just said, I'm going to walk by faith and take the next right step. We use that a lot in our work with women, because if they decide to call the police on their husband, that's the next right step. They don't know what the outcome is. Sounds really scary. He might lose his job. Maybe their church. We've had women who their churches have been excommunicating them because they called the police on an abusive husband, because this is a secular authority. You shouldn't call the authorities on that. I'm like, call the police. That's what God put them there for. If you're in danger, call the police. But it becomes scary when you do the next right thing and you don't know what's going to happen. We like to know. And so this is the part of trusting God and moving forward in truth, in what God says to do, even though you don't know or it doesn't feel right. I love the story in Judges chapter 6 of Gideon. Remember when he said, Gideon, this is who you are. This is your identity. You're a mighty warrior. And Gideon says, who, me? I'm not a mighty warrior. I'm just like this little farmer from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm not that. And God said, yes, you are. No, go act like one. Go in the strength that you have. And so Gideon started doing some little warrior things, like he cut down his father's idol poles in the backyard in the middle of the night so no one would know it was him. I mean, he didn't do it perfectly. He didn't do it like a warrior. He did it like a scared little man, but he did it. He walked in faith. And as he did it, and as he began to take those steps, Gideon became what God said he was.
Wow. I can tell I'm going to truly ask you to come back often, because you have so much to add to the program. I love that next step, because I want to touch base about something that you talked about in goal setting, about brushing your teeth. We'll come back to that for just a minute, okay? But the next step, James says that we look in the mirror and we see ourselves, the true self, the self that God sees us. And we really get excited about it, whether it's from a sermon, whether it's from hearing and counseling with you. We walk out and we've really been transformed by that vision. But transformation is something that has to be constant. But that verse then goes and says, but you immediately forget what you saw. Do you see that when you work with marriages that in relationships, that old nature, that old character, that all false lies come rising back up? Do you see that commonly, or individuals?
I do, and it happens to me. That wasn't the first time that I thought a door was locked. That it wasn't. It was so funny, so I didn't tell the rest of the story. So I was with a group of women who had already heard the first story a couple of years ago, when I almost peed my pants because I couldn't get into something because I thought it was locked and it really wasn't. So this is what my friend said when I came back and said, oh no, the door's locked. She goes, I think I've heard that before from you. I'm going to go check it out. And that's when she went and checked it out. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so that's why it's so important that we live in community. Hebrews tells us, let us encourage one another day after day, lest any one of us become hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And sin doesn't have to be like, oh, I've committed adultery. Sin can just be unbelief. Sin can be small little things. And so my friend helped me in that moment to say, wait a minute, you believed this before and you thought the door was locked. And it's a silly example, but when we have friends who say, you've been in this journey before, and what happened? How did you slide back down to that place where you're not worth anything, or you don't have any abilities, or, you can't do it. You can do this. You've done hard things before. And we need one another for that kind of support and encouragement to remind us of who we really are. Just like we need mirrors. We need to look in the mirror every day, because I don't know about you, but when I wake up, I don't look like this. So when I wake up, I look in the mirror and say, yep, you got to fix your hair. You got to go in the shower. You got to get some makeup on. And we make those corrections every single day to our physical body. Why wouldn't we have to do that spiritually as well?
Oh, so true. You know, we just got done doing a retreat for all our audience. It was a full-blown retreat to really go and create the highest priority in your life of goals. And we melted it down to one, and that was to become Christ-like and do God's will. But in turn, I gave a statistic that I know that you've shared on some other broadcasts as I want to tap into, that by mid-January and mid-February, 80 to 89% of all New Year's resolutions with good intent, with good, feelings that have probably been repeated 1,000 times already are failed already. In fact, one of the apps called on their calendar, I'm a cyclist, so I, got this app that carries my measurements of everything I'm doing. And it says that January 19th is the quitter's day. They have that on that because that statistically, from Harvard's research and everything else, is the failure day, that these intents fail. But you shared the most amazing, and I've been teaching goal setting biblically based for a lot of years. I've never heard the way that you taught about adding to your toothbrush every morning habit, another habit. Can you share that? Because that's so rich. I think that'll be really worthwhile listening to.
So you learn a new habit by linking it to a current habit. So I habitually brush my teeth. I would never forget to brush my teeth twice a day, at least twice a day, once in the morning and once at night. But I wasn't exercising. And so again, we always think, oh, New Year's resolution, I'm going to exercise. And so, I like to hike and I like to play pickleball, but I wasn't doing any strength training or any that kind of stuff. I was just too busy. So I decided last year that I would link a habit to my toothbrushing routine. So every morning when I brush my teeth, I do 50 squats while I'm brushing my teeth, because I'm going to brush for 2 minutes. So I can do 50 squats in 2 minutes. That's all I do. And then at night, I do 50 lunges on each leg while I'm brushing my teeth. And I've done that for, I would say 365 days last year. And I took a fitness test on my lower body. And for my age, I am way up in the, pretty fit. So this year I decided that I'm going to add, so for January, I started a new habit. So after I brush my teeth, every day I do I call them man's push-up. I could only do one January 1st. That was the only thing I could do. It's just one. And I could only get a little bit down. Well, now it's January 27th and I have to do 27 of them today. Now I can't do all 27 in a row, but I still do 27 throughout the day. So after I brush my teeth in the morning, before I brush my teeth at night, and after I eat lunch, because I always eat lunch, I'm doing my push-ups because I'm linking it to another habit so that I can keep my upper body. So I still do my toothbrushing exercise. I do my, and it doesn't take any more time, really. But now I'm getting this exercise done that I never was able to find the time to go to the gym and do all that. Now I'm getting it done.
And it's neat that you're just linking it to something that is habitually a habit already in your system, which is really, I think it's a key to a lot of the issues. We actually, in your beautiful workshop, have created cards that go on your mirror. They kind of stick to the mirror and they're affirmations. So while I'm going to use this one, as you're brushing your teeth, you're speaking out, hopefully, when you get the brush out of your mouth, I am precious, I'm wonderfully made, I'm beautiful. Went through all the scripture declarations of a beautiful woman. And it's interesting because if you do what you just said, if you use it into not a new discipline or a new habit, because that makes it hard. It mentally, it just seems harder. But the reality is you connected it. I just can't tell you, from Steve Covey to Michael Hyatt to any of the people that I've worked with, I've never heard them put that connection together. So bravo for what the Spirit has taught you in that area.
And yeah, thank you. And I would encourage you also to say those things, those affirmations out loud. I read a book, I can't even remember where it was, from years and years and years ago on psychology. And they did this exercise, and I've done this with women's retreats, and you might want to try it with your audience, when your live audience or your groups. When a woman, so I bring a woman up and I say, okay, I want you to put your hand out and let me push it down. So I would always pick a younger woman so that they could hold it up and I wouldn't be able to push their arm down. And then I'd say, okay, now I want you to stand here and I want you to say out loud 10 times, I am a weak and worthless person. And they'd say, I don't feel that way. I said, just say it. And they would say it 10 times. And I'd put their arm out and it would just go right down. And then I'd say it 10 times out loud, I am a strong and worthwhile person. And sometimes people would start to sob. And it was really interesting because when they'd say, I'm a weak and worthless person, they would start really strong, like, I am a weak and worthless. And by the time 10 times came around, it would be like their body posture was different. They would be saying, I am a weak and worthless person. And then we would do the other opposite. I'm a strong and worthwhile person. And they'd start like, I am a strong, and by the 10th time, their voice tone, their posture, their arm was out there, and I could not push it down. And just having all the audience see that happen, that transformation in that small period of time, just through words out loud, affecting your body. It was amazing.
That's amazing. That really, in fact, I think they do some testing on that, even for telling the truth or telling a lie. In the legal, examination. There's another method that works too, that kind of Romans 10, that says faith comes from hearing. I have them do that confession in a recorder and then play it through the day. And I tell them, go to the bathroom stall and play it out, or wherever you want to go, to get quiet and listen to your voice speak to you what the scripture has put through you in your prayer time or your journaling time. And it's just amazing, because I think that there's so much starvation for encouragement, for right truths about individuals, and so many people are broken and crushed. And it's really refreshing, but it's like you said, it's hard for them to come back and say, I'm strong and courageous, or whatever the term is, after they have felt that breaking. And I think you're doing an incredible job with all the methods that you're doing. Tell us about the books that you've written since that first one, because I know that wasn't the last one. Am I correct?
Right.
Because Amazon's got you listed with a whole lot of books. So.
Every book became like a pregnancy. I'm like, God, I'm too old now. No more pregnancies. But so I wrote, the first book was called The Truth Principle. It was renamed How to Live Right When Your Life Goes Wrong. And it was really, somewhat of a story of my life of how to take these 5 elements of truth, TRUTH, and walk them out. And so that's still available. And then I thought, oh God, here's the miracle. We did that. And I had no aspirations to write a second book. And then I had a man sitting in my office who was saying, Leslie, I'm doing everything that they tell me to do, to be a godly man. I've gone to Promise Keepers. I've gone to this. My wife still won't forgive me. She's bitter. She's resentful. How do I stay married like this? I just can't do it. And so, a lot of the marriage books at that time were about, well, if you do this, then your wife will be better. If you do this, then your husband will come to his senses. And I wanted to write a book that said, maybe that's not going to happen. So why should you act right when your spouse acts wrong? Right. And so that book came out. And then I wrote a book on humility. And that was actually my least popular book, because who thinks they need humility? Nobody. And so it didn't felt need for anybody, but I think it was one of my better books. And then I wrote a book on depression, which I've had experience with, and a book on happiness. And then I wrote The Emotionally Destructive Relationship, because I wanted to talk about what I had learned as a Christian with my mom, because the typical answers in the church are, well, forgive and reconcile. Well, how do you reconcile with someone you're still scared of, you would never leave your kids with? How do you have a real relationship with someone who yells at you and calls you names and threatens to kill you and is darn scary? Like, you can't. And so I'm like, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian counselor. I want to honor God. Do I have to invite my mother for Christmas? Do I have to let her babysit my kids? Do I not have boundaries? And so I began digging deep into the scriptures about all of that topic, because I didn't want to mislead people in my counseling. And I had the problem myself. I didn't know what to do. So that book came out, and then I felt like I needed to take the next step with The Emotionally Destructive Marriage. And so that was my last book. My main ministry right now is dealing with Christian women in destructive marriages, both educating and helping them heal and grow and make good decisions for themselves and their children, as well as teaching church leaders and pastors.
And you've had a couple courses, because I've signed up for a number of them that you've had. Do you have a course as well? Because you've done some webinar classes that you've sent out.
So my entire ministry right now is online. I don't have a counseling practice anymore. I do a lot of teaching online. I do a lot of free webinars. If someone signs up on my email list, if they just go to my website, leslievernick.com, there's a little handout on 7 tips of how someone manipulates you and what you can do to avoid that. And then they'll get a notice of when I do a lot of free training. I do about 4 or 5 webinars a year. I'm going to be doing one February, I think 13th on 4 Christian teachings that keep Christian women scared, stuck, and feeling crazy in their marriage. Like, God hates divorce. God doesn't hate all divorce. He hates some divorce. And so we need to help a woman understand, what kind of divorce does God hate? And is there a place for a Christian woman to say, God is okay with my divorce? And that's a red hot topic, but I think that's really important. Or I just need to keep trying harder and then he'll change. You know, Jesus did everything he could do with Judas, and Judas didn't change. And so sometimes we don't change people. They change because they are submitting themselves to God. And God doesn't change people who don't ask for that. And so sometimes we're putting hope in the wrong place, because God can change people. Yes, he can, but he never changes anybody who's not asking for it.
Well, that's a really, is your next book probably, but you know, the change of wanting change. I was just doing an interview with one of our guests, and she just was incredible in that regards, that she just had such a hunger for learning more about God, learning that intimacy, really being his bride. And I mean, even just listening to her, like you, the passion of want, I think is the flavor that God most is drawn to. And when we get
your one thing, you know, you just did this retreat. Well, it's my one thing. And if we think of Paul's writing, he would say the same thing. One thing is God's will for you. Because we all like, what's God's will for me? One thing, that you mature and live a godly life. That's your one thing. Your one thing. And so when someone's squashed and not able to do that because it threatens their husband's ego, they're not able to grow and live a holy life. They're not able to learn, and that's hardwired into us to want to do that. And so when you're not allowed to do that, or someone doesn't want to, they're called foolish in the Bible, but they don't want to. Lazy, proud, evil, it's very difficult to grow when you're in that environment. And so that's the rub. If it's God's will for you to thrive and grow and you're not allowed to, what do you do with that?
I know we're coming towards the end of our time together, and I do want to open the invitation for the future, especially try to help get more people to hear about your next webinar. Advice that you give every day, and I know that, as I said and I quoted, that you are true to scripture. What advice, both men and women, because, you know, like you said, it can go either way. What advice, top 3 pieces of advice that you would share and leave with the audience that would help their life take that next right step, as you've shared with us?
One is, you have to learn to let go of the outcome. So when we think about people who took the next right step, and I love the story of Ruth, because here she lost everything, her husband, she had no security. She's going back to Bethlehem with her cranky mother-in-law, who's not in good place. And so even before that, when Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said, you know, both of you go back to your own family, Ruth had a decision to make. And so she made the next right choice, what she thought was right. Nope, I'm going with you. Right? Nope, I'm going with you. That was her. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if Naomi would say, no, you're not. She didn't know if Naomi would say, okay. She didn't know what would happen when she got back. She just made the next right decision. She just didn't stay paralyzed in grief and depression. She did something on her behalf. And I believe that when we make a decision, even if it's a wrong decision, God gives us information. He tells us, I will instruct you in the way that you should go. And so if we make a wrong decision, that informs us then to turn around and make a different decision. But at least we're moving. We're not just getting stuck in life. So take the next right step. Don't worry about the outcome. Learn from that next right step what the next right step is. When Ruth got to Bethlehem, everybody's bellies were hungry. And she said, hey, I'm going to go out in that field and glean some leftover wheat. That was her next right step. She didn't know it was Boaz's field. She didn't know what was going to happen next. But as it so happened, God was weaving the backstory in there, and Ruth just took the next right step. So I think if we can come to trust our Heavenly Father, that He is always in our story, but we have a part to play in our story. We can't control all the characters. We can't control all the situations, but are we going to be the hero, the victim, or the villain in our story. We get to decide. And when we begin to realize we have that choice, it empowers us to be the kind of person we want to be.
Wow. Boy, that's beautiful. That is just beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm going to link the Deuteronomy's 30, verse 19 and 20. Life and death is before us. Choose life is God's advice. And you've just given that advice to us as well in modern terms, and I appreciate you. We are going to have all of the information, all the contact information of Leslie. Please reach out. But here's something that's most important to you as a listening audience, is there was way beyond just the normal compact. As I said in the beginning, this was going to be a working podcast. Re-listen to this. Slice it, as the scripture says, slice it down so that you can take it bite-sized pieces and make your notes. Make this a working podcast for your life so that you can find and search, as Leslie shared with us, the right next step for your life. Leslie, I thank you so much for being a part of Hearing God's Voice podcast. You've added so much, besides being beautiful and a beautiful scenery behind you and the Arizona sun coming through the windows. I think that's just a part of your beautiful framing. And I really do open the invitation anytime to come back and join us and share some of the wisdom God has continued to give you.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate meeting you and being on your podcast.
Listen, we'll be back next week with another podcast interview to help you become beautiful inside and out, and by that process of hearing God's voice. And as we've learned today from Leslie's experience, believe in it, and then walking out that next step. Have a beautiful and precious, wonderful day.